Hello, hello.
Hey, Marcia, how are you?
Doing good. How are you, Rob?
Well, thank you.
So let's get your brain here today. Appreciate your time. And
No, my pleasure.
yeah, so if you can start, Rob, by sharing a little bit of your background for those that don't know you and how you evolved through your career.
Yeah, sure. My career started a long time ago now, so probably in pigs full time was 1990 when I did my PhD, and from there I went and became a research scientist in nutrition for the South Australian government, and I did that for 6 or 7 years. Ultimately, became a nutrition consultant, and then through that process got involved with the 𝘭𝘭𝘺-𝘭𝘆 group in Queensland in about 2002. And ultimately ended up chairing the board of that company. And in 2016, we decided to integrate their companies. And when we took on that integrated supply chain, I moved into an executive role. So now I'm the group CEO and managing director of 𝘬𝘭𝘺, which is now it's a 46,000 sow aggregation across Australia, and then another 3,000 sows in New Zealand.
Very good. And it always impressed me the amount of research, right, that you guys do in Australia. Any insights there, like, why is that? Or I guess if we had to calculate the number of pigs under trial divided by the sow inventory in the country, you guys probably would be at the top. So why is that?
Look, we have enjoyed a really good research history. It's had some highs and lows, and I suppose we're probably at a low point in the cycle at the moment.
Okay.
But traditionally, we have invested very heavily in research. We probably need to do that from the point of view that our pork per se is not discernibly different. We don't have any specific attributes. So if we have to compete on a cost of production basis, we're well behind. Our labour costs are very high. Our freight costs are very high. Now our feed costs have been high in drought conditions, etc. So really, if we're to be competitive, we've had to invest heavily in research. That's one reason. The other reason is the Australian government's been quite supportive of agricultural research, and there have been a number of good systems. So for every pig that dies, $1 goes to a levy, and the government matches that dollar. So there's a base $10 million pool to start with. And we've also had the cooperative research centre schemes, where we've been able to bring key players in industry together to create, $30-40 million pools of cash for 8-year research programs, and that's been, really useful for the industry.
Very good. And so that dollar you say, is that Australian dollar, and what's the currency? I don't recall now.
It's Australian dollar, and we're about 70 cents US at the moment. So
okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And so from the last several decades there, Rob, what do you think would be the top few studies or areas that you saw significant advance there through research?
Yep. Look, one piece of research where we have a significant competitive advantage is the NIR calibrations for digestible energy and for reactive lysine in oilseed meals. And the reason I say it's a competitive advantage is that research has taken place over the last 20 years. And the way the research program was set up, we can integrate different years worth of research into the same calibration. So we run what we call, we run samples every year that allow us to link the research back to the previous year. So that's very hard to set up from scratch, and it would take a very, very long time to generate the same pool of samples that we have with that level of research integration over a 20-year period. So that technology is commercially available now and is being used more and more widely, and it generates reasonable returns for the Australian pork industry that we then reinvest in research.
Oh, wow.
So, I think that's a unique piece of research that Australia has stood out on in previous years. Other areas where we've done a lot of research, I think, were in relation to the use of ractopamine, use of 𝘠𝘭𝘆𝑉𝑎𝑐 or 𝘠𝘭𝘆𝑉𝑒𝑠𝑡.
Yes.
We've done a massive amount of that. Unfortunately, ractopamine's now, totally out of the market from a customer demand perspective.
Yeah.
But we use the 𝘠𝘭𝘆𝑉𝑎𝑐 very widely because most of the retail carcasses in Australia are male, and we don't castrate. So pretty much every male pig is vaccinated. And if we go to more recently, some of the really interesting stuff I'm seeing is through the 𝘧𝘰𝘵 group at the University of Queensland. He has a Ph.D. student called Max Bravo, who's been doing some work on the influence of different amino acids on satiety. And he has some really interesting results, which, kind of suggest, excesses of lysine, etc., can have quite a negative impact on feed intake. So we look at the safety factors, if you like, in the amount of lysine we allow in diets, as an example. But it's a really interesting path of research, and there'll be a lot more to follow on from it, I'm sure.
Very interesting. And is he looking mostly finishing pigs or also gestating sows?
At the moment, he's looking primarily at weaner pigs, but he's really focused on the mechanisms and which amino acids affect which satiating factors in which part of the gut.
Wow.
So, and he's created quite an interesting portfolio of research that, like all good research, probably asks more questions than it answers. But I think there'll be a lot of people very interested in what he has to say. Yeah,
and I also wonder if is it because of the lysine that's lower, or because since the lysine is lower, the tryptophan ratio and the valine ratio is higher, so maybe that's why they have higher intake. But I'll be
no, he's actually looked at that, and he's actually relating the lysine intake to the release of specific satiating hormones and other factors in the gut.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very nice.
So it's very interesting.
I guess another area that you guys have done very interesting research is the simplifying the number of diets, right? And what's been the uptake there, and have you guys implemented, or what's the status?
It's interesting that you asked that question, because I was going through some internal research on single diets yesterday. Within Sunpork, and I've obviously been involved as a director of the Pork CRC and of Australian Pork Limited with all of that early research that was done in Australia with single diets. And the data is the data, but then marrying that to commercial realities and risk mitigation from a commercial reality perspective is another thing altogether.
Right.
Look, the research that we've done in the past on nutrition is excellent. I mean, there is obviously a change in requirements as we move, from a little pig to a big pig. And until I see some research that shows that there is a benefit, if you like, through maintaining a single diet through less changes affecting intake, I still conceptually struggle with the concept that you can take a big hit early on and make up for it later on. Why not try and marry those phases if there's no negative impact of a diet change? And if there is in Australia a small push to increased P2, that can actually push a significant portion of that pig population out of our premium markets. So while you might have a cost of production saving, you can have a value chain depression. So I would like to see a lot more research done on the single diet concept, particularly over the change of seasons, where we come from maybe a very warm season into autumn, for example, where the pigs traditionally eat a lot more, where they've had a slow start, and when they're coming into a better diet and they're eating a lot, how that affects the outcome.
Right.
That's number one. The second thing, Marcio, is worldwide, even with renewal of the NRC recommendations, etc., worldwide, we haven't done any detailed requirement studies the way we used to do them 20 or 30 years ago with our modern genotypes. We often extrapolate a lot of data, that type of research is very expensive. And to be honest, I mean, I think there's a lot more to be gained out of some detailed requirement studies done properly, empirically, like we used to do them, that give us the new requirements, and try to review our diets relative to that, because we're dealing with a very different pig to the one that when all that traditional research was done. So I would love to see some worldwide investment in proper requirement studies.
Yes. And let me ask you there, when you say, are you talking mostly nitrogen balance studies or dose response of
dose response type studies with different nutrients? I mean, an interesting thing is requirements are going to be, they're dependent entirely on intake. And I can put a challenge out there. Go and look at how the intake figures in NRC have changed in 30 years.
Right.
They haven't.
Right.
Very, very little. Okay. So, and that's just not true. We know the intake has dropped significantly. So I think we need to do some revisiting of requirement studies.
No, completely agree. Yeah. Well, my experience when I go into the NRC model, and because there's the Excel spreadsheet, and I update the data there, like PD max or intake and other things. Actually, the wheat finish turns out to be fairly accurate to when folks go and do a dose response of just feed the pigs and weigh the pigs type of study. So I think that's comforting. But then the gestating side of things is where it's interesting, right? Because
very limited. It's all extrapolation from growers, and I suppose if you're outside of North America, how valuable those NRC data points are for us is questionable. We're in a different environment with a different pig with a different set of ingredients. So we are extrapolating grower data primarily in terms of digestibilities, etc., of ingredients, and then requirement studies have been very difficult.
Right. And I think Ron Ball from Canada and 𝘧𝘁𝘍𝑒𝑐, they did some nitrogen balance for gestation, but it's a whole different ball game, right? Because you need you need a lot of sows to be able to do some of them. I love it. Very cool. How about if we transition a little bit into the leadership side of things, and just running a business, a pig business, for you, what has been the biggest lessons there?
We've had a variety of challenges. I suppose when I look at what's happening in the US now, and I look at comparing our New Zealand business with our Australian business, with the amount of capital you have to invest in pig farming these days, I'm certainly more comfortable having control of a business that goes from genetics to retail than I am stopping at the farm gate, or alternatively being a processor and relying on somebody to supply me with all my pigs. So having control, I think, is critical these days. It allows you to marry your supply to your demand and your disposal models, and it gives you some kind of protection in the business. So that's an important first step as far as I'm concerned. And then I think, I say in Australia, we're two viruses away from oblivion. Coronavirus can shut down our slaughter plants. If we get African swine fever in Australia, it's going to be a very different operating environment, because under our emergency animal disease legislations, the government really does step in and control what will happen. You don't have a lot of say. So biosecurity and maintaining that at front of mind at all time at every level of the operation is critical here. On a positive note, with no international travel to Australia, we've had a reduction in the number of people bringing pork products in their suitcases. But we're still seeing significant amounts being intercepted at the Sydney and Melbourne postal centres, where people are sending pork products into Australia that could put us at significant risk. And finally, like any business, it comes down to engagement of your staff, having that staff engagement, and you need to spend probably a lot more time on that than you do on the technical aspects of pork production and pork processing. because with an engaged workforce, the rest becomes much easier.
Yes. Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah, you guys so close there to China, and wow. It's did you ever pick up a positive sample at a port or airport, or no?
They have detected non-viable ASF fragments in products that have been seized. So fortunately, there's never been any cultural virus that's entered the country that we're aware of.
Nice.
And hopefully our distances and population density does also mean we have a chance of controlling it relatively quickly if there ever was an outbreak in Australia.
Very good. And you mentioned engaging the people, Rob. Any tips there, or when you think about that, what do you think as strategies to improve the people side of things?
Yeah, I mean, the focus on de-siloing the business. So you have to have a business that integrates rather than this is the farming unit, this is the processing unit, this is the retail unit. You need to make those business units, you don't want to have any definable boundaries between them, really. You need every staff member to be working towards a common goal. And while you might think you're good at it, you can't spend too much time on communication at every level of the business. As soon as there's some perception that the leadership team operates at a different level to the guys on the slaughter floor or in the piggeries, things start falling apart. So you need to be able to communicate as effectively from the coalface right through to the board.
Very good. I love it. I love it. A few other things that I wanted to touch base from what we discussed already, Rob. One on the Improvac or Improvast, different names, right? Different countries, but your marketing weight is what? Live would be 105, 110, or what?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the market. So some retailers like a lighter weight, so they might be taking a 70 kilo average, 72 kilo average dead weight
carcass.
Other retailers take 76 to 78 kilos, and then in Australia we have Costco, so they'll take 100 kilo dead because they base Costco in Australia exactly the same as the US. So there's no real difference there. So we have quite a wide weight range of markets.
Okay, because as you think about that, and also the single diet in the US, K-State and a few other folks ran the similar concept, right? 2 or 3 diets, simplifying, and it's funny for some folks that listen. You mentioned single diet, but don't know the market weight. Some of the other studies, I think, they were okay at a single diet because it's a lighter pig than the US, which is 130 kg or so live weight, right? So 2 diets.
Yeah, so with a single diet, you've got more flexibility with a lighter sale weight, that's for sure. And I worry if we're going to the heavier weights. And for a very long time in Australia, we've pushed for heavier weights, or sorry, the producers have pushed for heavier weights, while the markets have pushed back. So Costco in Australia is unique in that they've shown us how to produce and deal with a heavyweight pig, and that's been quite successful for them. In the COVID environment, where people have lost their jobs, they're looking back for more home cooking, basic meat products. There's a bigger demand for our standard primal roasts, etc. So even some of the retailers that have traditionally wanted lighter pigs are now looking for a heavier weight. So instead of 2 roasts out of a leg or a shoulder, they can now get 3 with the same number of pigs. So we are seeing a shift. It is not all, it's not the money-making panacea that everybody thinks might be the case, particularly when you have a drought and you have very expensive feed, because in that last 5 weeks where you go to the heavier weights, they eat a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
So So yes, as we push to those heavier weights and a wider range in different markets, we do need to be cautious about single diet approach and how that might impact our premium product.
Very good. And I was going to mention about the 𝘭𝘭𝘺, and I was just thinking that, you know, of course, I believe Brazil and Australia are probably the places that use it the most. Any thoughts there? Because of course in the US, I think it's mostly, you hear a few different stories, right? You know, how to process it, but also mostly probably the perception of the consumer. What are your thoughts there? Any advice on that arena?
It's interesting about consumer perceptions, because sometimes those perceptions are simply there to provide leverage around price or you know, an easy path to that market. And with less pigs in Asia, the acceptance of male pigs that have been імпровакed is increasing. So because they're more interested in having access to the pork.
Right.
But look, імпровак or the whole concept of vaccinating against 𝘮𝘠𝘮𝘮𝘮 really is a very effective concept. It works very, very well, and it significantly reduces the incidence of boar taint. And from a welfare perspective and from a cost of production perspective in Australia, castration is out of the question. That is not an option, whatever size male pig we produce. So a product like імпровак is very much, and it's an important part of our production system. And the markets in Australia and New Zealand are certainly very comfortable accepting male pigs that have been імпровакed into their retail markets. So that's very positive. Where there's a concern or something that we need to manage is obviously the more vaccinations, the more chance there is of a broken needle or an abscess. So the procedures around needle management, around hygiene and abscess management have to be very tightly controlled, because the last thing we ever want to do is to have an undetected broken needle in a product. So in any form of reduction in antibiotic use, more judicious use of antibiotics, we're going to see more vaccinations. So it's not something that's going to diminish. It's only going to increase unless we come up with better ways to vaccinate. So for me today, the biggest thing that we could do to improve the use of a product like імпровак is to have better detection systems for needles and abscesses in carcasses. And to be blunt, all the work we do on eating quality of pork is second if we can't detect basic contaminants that might exist through the process of producing that pork. And you know, there are really no detectable needles that can be found without an X-ray, and you know, it's very difficult to detect abscesses prior to a carcass going into a boning room. So these are technologies I'd love to see developed rapidly.
Very good. Yeah, that makes total sense. And then I guess two questions. One on the antibiotics, the trend there, what do you see? And then second, the whole thing that I always like when I travel to Australia, I always like to get the insights on the border and not importing genetics. So of course that's a common question there. So thoughts on the antibiotics trends there, Rob?
I'll talk on behalf of our business. I mean, we see it as critical, and we have our own veterinarians, and we have a very strong focus on more judicious use of antibiotics. So we started a dedicated program of antibiotic use reduction in the business in 2017, and we're about 57–60% reduction now on where we started. So very, very positive progress, and we don't use any critical antibiotics that from a human health perspective. So that's been very, very positive progress. And I think anybody involved in pork production is going to have the same level of focus, with, of course, removal of in-feed antibiotics being the first and the biggest step you can take to have a reduction. In terms of antibiotic-free production, if that is only possible by having two streams where these are the ones that were never treated and all the rest to go over here, that's not sustainable, certainly not in a big business. So that's just marketing from my perspective, and you're kidding yourself if you think you've made progress in that respect. So not an option. Long term.
Just a parenthesis there. Why is that? Just because you need to completely change your mindset to like burn the boats and go all in, or what's the thoughts there?
Well, I think, I mean, you really aren't making progress. You're still heavily reliant on antibiotics. If any animal has to be directed into an antibiotic stream, it's managed in the same way that you used to.
Right.
Okay? You haven't made progress. There's just the lucky few that weren't treated. That end up in the antibiotic-free market.
Got it.
Just remember, the more of that happens, the more it'll be expected as a base, and something's going to have to happen with all these pigs that are treated with antibiotics. So, you know, you're better off having every pig on a level playing field when it hits the market, and truly trying to work towards reduction. That's my view there.
Yeah.
So, and look, more vaccines, obviously the way forward there.
Very good.
And better genetics if you can get some disease resistance in there. The second part of your question was around genetic imports into Australia.
Yep.
So look, before you even get to genetic potential, the current import protocols for Australia won't change while the Australian pork industry maintains a hard line on the importation of genetics in any form, DNA to semen. Now, I think semen into Australia is unlikely ever. If anything was to change, you know, there are plenty of ways to bring in DNA without bringing in pigs or semen if we needed to introduce more diversity into our herds. So if we're to protect our domestic fresh meat market and remove the risk of any of those diseases that we don't have, like PRRS and African swine fever, etc., we're not importing. That's just firm. So how does that then affect us from our genetic potential and our international competitiveness from a cost of production point of view? I think, again, people are looking for very short-term Band-Aid solutions. If we can produce 30 pigs per sow per year, that's going to solve all our problems. Actually, all it'll do is flood our markets, and the price will go down so low, everyone goes broke. So these things can't be done in single steps. With genomics, since we've been involved in that, our rate of genetic progress has gone up exponentially.
Nice.
You know, our larger farms now that are in the order of, you know, say our 12,500 sow farm is now doing, you know, 26, 27 pigs per mated female per year. So, and that fits in very well with our capacity to eat during lactation, with our markets, with our current infrastructure. And I think we now have more opportunities to look at more traits and development of more traits without loss of commercial performance, without the need to import genetics from overseas.
Interesting. And is there, as I understand, there's two concerns of bringing genetics. One is the introduction of diseases, right?
Yes.
Diseases, but the other one is just the market aspect of things, like you said, right? Flood the market.
Yep.
Which one of the two is more important?
I think that, well, that's actually an easy question. It's disease.
Okay.
Because if you look at pork consumption in Australia, roughly half of it's imported now. Okay, so if we take 11 kilos per head per year as fresh and 14 kilos as processed, you know, half of that, 70% of that processed is currently imported. So we have what's into this country, but it has to be frozen. It has to be cooked at the port of receival. Can't have any nervous tissue, etc. So we already have significant impact from overseas markets into Australia. the capacity of those markets to influence our fresh meat market is probably limited anyway, because they're not going to have the capacity to get it here chilled and have sufficient shelf life on the retail shelves, and they certainly can't defrost it and sell it as chilled. So, you know, definitely disease in terms of the major impact as a result of importation of uncooked pork that ended up in our supply chain.
Interesting. Very good, Rob. Well, last few questions I have for you. One is, what is your favorite pig-related book?
I have to, there's a couple. One's called Lesser Beasts. Okay. They're more meat related, I suppose, but there is a book called Pig 5407 or something that has a little ear tag on the spine, and it's about that thick, and it goes through and gives you every product that's made from a pig. Wow. And I just think it's great for awareness, so people can see that, you know, we use everything but the squeal, and the number of everyday things that people utilize that have been derived from a pig. I think that's an excellent book. And the other one I like is a book by a guy called Simon Fairley called Meat, A Benign Extravagance, which really counters a lot of the myths around the impact of meat on the environment and how meat fits into a modern diet, etc. So I enjoy those books. I
need to check that out. I think I've seen the one you mentioned, the tag, and you know, it's crazy, right? Brushes, awesome. Heparin, and all those things. So.
Yeah. Oh, and there's a new market. I mean, the worldwide heparin market's gone through the roof. Yeah.
No
it's
kidding.
A very profitable market at the moment.
Wow. How about any book not related to pigs that has really changed the way you think?
Here's a good book about leadership. That's about Shackleton's rescue of his stranded ships in Antarctica and how he led his team and stopped them eating each other. That was, wow. You know, it's an excellent book on leadership and certainly changed the way I think. There's also a new book by a guy called Simon Sinek called The Infinite Game. He's written a couple of other books like Leaders Eat Last and Start With Why. And then his latest book called The Infinite Game is great for you know, encouraging your team not to focus on, you know, the short-term goals and having the short-term wins at all costs. It's more about the long-term journey and playing for that game. And he makes some excellent comparisons between Microsoft and Apple, etc., and how those businesses developed, because one had an infinite game in mind, the other one was playing the short games.
Wow, very interesting. And then lastly, what do you think sets apart successful swine professionals from those that are not?
Number one, they're dedicated to the industry at all levels. So that's their life. It's not, you know, I don't want to get into debates about work-life balance, but people that commit, that pork industry are generally more successful than the ones that operate from the periphery part-time, number one. And it is an industry where it's so fluid. You need to be embedded in it to understand what's happening, because this week's going to be very different to next week. There's always some challenges there. The second thing, and you know, other countries maybe like Canada have been way ahead of us, but Australia is catching up, and that is the reason I'm in my role as a managing director of a integrated pork business is because I'm a scientist. My shareholders recognise that pork production is a science-based business today, and if you can combine a good, firm science-based with business acumen, you're going to be very successful, and truly understand the levers that affect profitability and sustainability in pork. You're then going to inform the research and make much better use of the research than you otherwise would do. So that would be my suggestion.
I love it. Very, very nice. That's a good way to end our conversation here today, Dr.
Thanks, Marcia.
Appreciate your time today. And you're in the future there in Australia, so it sounds like everything is fine in the future. So everyone should be happy.
Yeah, hopefully. Keep the viruses out. We've got some great opportunities here.
Very good. Thanks so much. We'll be in touch.
No problem. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.